Yes, yes, you will. We'll make sure you get it. But yeah, it's in our monthly newsletter of all of our webinars. So thank you everybody for joining. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of flow, Friends of the Lower Olentangy Watershed. And then we're going to turn it over to Rebecca Rose of the Ohio Wildlife Center in Powell. And she's going to talk about gimme shelter, rescuing and rehabilitating wildlife, which is a topic that's close to my heart. Number one reason I got involved with flow is to help wildlife, because there's not many people, unfortunately, that are speaking up for wildlife, and flow is one of the groups that is doing that. So at Flow and our Education and Outreach Committee, what we are focused on is creating opportunities in the community to educate people about the watershed, the Lower Olentangy Watershed specifically, and encourage residents to take an active role in some way to care and protect the watershed. So that may be participating in litter pickup when we host those, or we give away a lot of native trees, free trees to the community. We encourage people to plant those within the watershed in their yard preferably. And we also give away free pollinator plants as well. For those of you who don't know, the watershed, of course, includes, particularly the Lower Olentangy Watershed, includes the area from Delaware all the way down into downtown Columbus, where we focus on, as we focus on the Lower Olentangy Watershed. And the watershed includes not only the Olentangy River and the fish and the turtles and the frogs and the other creatures that live within the river, but also the wildlife, the trees, the riverbanks that live around the Olentangy. The watershed includes a number of communities, not necessarily the entire community, but portions of those communities. So for example, the Lower Olentangy Watershed includes portions of Columbus, Delaware, Worthington, Upper Arlington, and Grandview Heights. So whether, in your case, whether you adopt a storm drain, which when we had that rain event from a hurricane last week, heavy deluge of rain, if you adopt a storm drain to help keep those clear, so adopting a storm drain or participating in a litter pickup or tree planting, as I mentioned, or perhaps reducing the amount of turf that's in your yard to focus on planting native plants to support pollinators and the native birds. That's something you can do to help. And of course, being educated about what's happening within the watershed and how we can help. In today's program is about helping wildlife, injured wildlife in particular. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Rebecca Rose. I'd like to first tell you a little bit about her background. My screen here. Okay. All right. Sorry about this, folks. Well, Rebecca, I'll let you introduce yourself, tell us about your background. I will tell you that Rebecca Rose is from the Ohio Wildlife Federation, and prior to Wildlife Center, I'm sorry, and prior to joining the center, she was very much involved at the zoo. She retired from the zoo, I remember that from your background, and then joined the Wildlife Center. She also has, we were just chatting as many of you were joining, she also has become certified as a climate change advocate. She attended Vice President Gore's program webinar, I guess, during the pandemic. She might talk a little bit about that. And she's also been involved in a number of teaching programs throughout the community. Rebecca, if you could just tell us a little bit more about your background. I'm sorry, I can't pull it up on my screen right now.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, well, I worked at the Columbus Zoo for 30 years, and half of that time as an educator and the other half as the zoo's conservation director. So in that capacity, I manage the zoo's conservation grants program. So the Columbus Zoo supports conservation projects all over the world, especially small grassroots projects all over the world. So that was the source of a lot of my traveling. And during that time, one of the trends that I noticed most, so I reviewed the grants and had a committee that reviewed grants and managed that program. One of the trends that I noticed just really skyrocketing over those years was more and more people applying for grants who were rescuing wild animals, who were starting or running or continuing rescue centers throughout the world. And I got really interested in this, especially after I met some of the people that do this work. And it's quite remarkable, really, the lengths that people go to help save wild animals and bring them back to health and try to get them back to the wild. Many of the people that do this in other parts of the world, it's not unusual. It's not overstating it to say that they risk their lives at times. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But so the point I wanted to make is that the Ohio Wildlife Center, as our Central Ohio, our largest rescue center in Ohio, is really part of a global network of people that are doing this type of work. So from our backyards, from our neighborhoods in Central Ohio to the farthest reaches of the globe, this is a little bonobo at a sanctuary in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, nobody really knows for sure how many individual animals are being under human care in rescue centers, but it's growing all the time. And the good news is that we're getting very good at it. So just as an example, one of the people that I met through my work at the zoo was a young Malaysian man named Suti Wong, who was a researcher, and he was studying sun bears in Borneo, on the island of Borneo. This is the smallest of the world's 8 species of bears. And he was planning to be a scientist and do research. But as he was doing his studies throughout villages in Borneo, he saw so many sun bears in captivity in terrible conditions, living in very small cages. People had decided that they were cute and they would make a good pet, so they had been taken out of the wild. And of course they are cute, but they're bears, hello. And they do not make, they make terrible pets, as all wild animals do. As Margaret Wrinkle, the author, says, nothing in nature wants to be a pet. So he really changed course after he finished his PhD, and he started the first ever sun bear conservation center to rescue some of these animals and get them into a situation where they could be rehabilitated and released back to the wild. So all of these rescue centers across the world and all the people rescuing animals, this is really a sign of much larger problems globally. And a report recently from World Wildlife Fund tells us that we've wiped out 69%, almost 70% of vertebrates, of mammals, birds, fish, and reptiles, individuals, not species, but individuals, since 1970. There are at least 1 million species are in danger of extinction. Annihilation of wildlife is now an emergency that threatens human civilization. It's really a co-crisis with climate change. Of course, there's a lot of connections between climate change and loss of biodiversity, but the biodiversity crisis is right up there. It doesn't get talked about as much, but it's definitely happening, and it's a very serious concern. So most of the animals in rescue centers throughout the world are mammals and birds, as you can imagine. Those are the ones that we're going to most easily see and find. And these are a couple of flying fox bats at a rescue center in Australia. There are rescue centers for reptiles, and I'm happy to say that we have a wonderful one in Cincinnati called the Arrowhead Reptile Rescue. This is a rescue center that's licensed by the Ohio Division of Wildlife, which everyone in Ohio that does wildlife rescue and rehabilitation must be licensed by the Ohio Division of Wildlife. And they do a wonderful job of rescuing, rehabilitating not only native Ohio reptiles, but also exotic pets that people, unfortunately, often want to discard after a while. When it comes to reptile rescue, this man, Murthy Katamahanti, he's one of my heroes because, believe it or not, this man works in India and he rescues this animal. If you don't recognize that, that's the king cobra. And not many people really care about king cobras. In fact, people just want to kill them on sight. Actually, king cobras are very beneficial to ecosystems. They are snake eaters, so they eat other snakes, and they're very shy around people, but they're often killed on sight. And so this man took upon himself to start a rescue group for king cobras, working with villages, working with farmers, so that he could capture and relocate these animals so that they're not being killed needlessly by people. So why do wild animals need to be rescued? There are so many reasons. I went to a presentation down at OSU a couple weeks ago, which was the Ohio Ohio Cooperative Wildlife Conference, sorry. And there was a rehabilitator from Cleveland who made this really extensive list of reasons, things that we see happening in Ohio and of course other states throughout the country and throughout the world. But you can see that there are a few natural things that happen to animals that they end up in rescue centers. Sometimes there's a failed prey, predator tries to take an animal and just injures it and somebody finds it, but that's pretty unusual. It's almost always things that people do. And I just want to call attention to the cats at the top of the list. I love cats. I have cats of my own, but cats kill and injure a lot of our native wildlife, especially songbirds, to the tune of about 3.4 billion songbirds per year, just in the United States. And there's all kinds of other things that the animals run into, poisons that are put out to kill rodents, entanglement in fishing line hooks, entanglement in holiday decorations, soccer nets. Kidnapped means animals that are taken out of the wild illegally as pets. Of course, car collisions is probably one of the #1 reasons that we receive animals at our rescue center. Ohio is a very densely populated state, and along with a dense population goes a very high road density. So I don't think I need to tell any of you how many of our wild animals are killed on the roads. So I like to say there are 8 billion reasons why animals have to be rescued. I keep having to change that slide. As you know, we just hit 8 billion people on our planet just a few days ago. So some of the really large overarching reasons that animals are rescued and that animals are lost is, of course, habitat destruction. And that's true in the United States as well as throughout the world. And maybe you remember back in 2019, 2020, the fire season in Australia, the bushfires. I mean, they have bushfires all the time, but that particular year was just absolutely horrible. And at first it was estimated that 1 billion animals were killed or displaced. And now they've moved that up to 3 billion animals that researchers and scientists feel were killed or displaced during those terrible fires. And all these pictures that you see here are animals that were injured. On the left in the little pink blanket is a wombat, a koala, of course, with burns, and then an echidna, which is one of the 2 egg-laying mammals in the world. So habitat destruction, it's a huge one that's driving the loss of biodiversity, of course. And what is habitat? It's simple: food, water, shelter, space. If animals don't have that, they can't live. And of course, neither can we. This is an aerial shot of the island of Borneo, where I visited several times over the years because we supported several projects here through the Columbus Zoo. And these lowland tropical forests in Southeast Asia and on the island of Borneo are some of the oldest and most diverse, biologically diverse forests on the planet. And from 1990 to 2010, 8.7 million acres of these forests were converted to oil palm plantations. I'm sure you've all heard about oil palm. It's in everything. And it's a crop that has brought a lot of people out of poverty, but it's been devastating for the environment. And because of this huge, massive loss of forests, so many animals were displaced. Some of the more high-profile mammals that were displaced and injured and orphaned were orangutans, the only great ape in the world that lives outside of Africa. And during this time when this massive deforestation was happening, thousands and thousands of adult orangutans were killed, and many more thousands of babies ended up in rescue centers in Malaysia and Indonesia. And I've visited several of these rescue centers over the years. Both species of orangutans are now critically endangered. And I don't know if any of you have read this book, Sapiens, by Yuval Noah Harari, but he describes our species, Homo sapiens, as ecological serial killers, which is kind of amusing, but also disturbing. But we have been destroying species for thousands of years. This is nothing new. This is an example. The statistic kind of blows your hair back. 96% of all mammals on Earth are livestock and humans. 4% of mammals on Earth are wild mammals. 60% of all birds on our planet are poultry, chickens and turkeys, other poultry. 30% are wild birds. So that gives you a very serious, sobering idea of how we've altered the planet. So the amount of habitat conversion, land conversion that is done just to feed the animals that people eat globally is completely unsustainable. One of the other overarching issues that causes the displacement and death and injury of wildlife is poaching and the illegal wildlife trade. So wildlife crime is a big business, as you can imagine. So this involves everything from parts of animals like rhino horn, tiger skins, to live animals like the trade in live chimpanzees and other primates. Logging, fishing, and wildlife trade is worth $1 to $2 trillion per year, according to the World Bank. It's hard to know exactly, of course, because it's illegal, but it is absolutely huge. And it is a very high-level criminal activity. Wildlife trade, it's one of the world's largest illegal markets, along with counterfeit products, human trafficking. And this animal, maybe some of you know what this is. This is the world's most trafficked animal that most people have never heard of. This is a pangolin. There are 7 species of pangolins in Asia and Africa, and they're literally being trafficked to death, into extinction. They are the only mammal that has scales, and their scales are basically just like our fingernails. And this is a photo of a confiscation that happened last year at one of the ports in Southeast Asia, but all of these huge bags are full of pangolin scales. So you can imagine this is thousands and thousands of dead pangolins. And these scales are sought after in the traditional Chinese medicine market. They're considered to be medicinal. They are not. They're just basically fingernails. They have no medicinal properties, but those kinds of myths and misinformation are really hard to dislodge. They're also trafficked as live animals for meat. They really have no defense except to curl up in a ball. They don't make any sound, so they're unfortunately pretty easy to smuggle. But when they are rescued alive, many of them can be taken to rescue centers. One in particular that I've been following that's in Liberia in West Africa, it's called Libasa Wildlife Sanctuary. They specialize in pangolins. In terms of great apes in Africa, this is a topic that I'm very familiar with because I've been serving on the board of directors for the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance, based here in the United States, but we raise funds and provide capacity building and training for 23 sanctuaries in 13 countries in Africa. All great apes in Africa are endangered or critically endangered. The trade is illegal in every African country where they're found, yet the laws are not often enforced. And worse than that, authorities are often involved in the illegal trade. So PASA, the Pan-African Sanctuary Alliance, I'm happy to say, was given its first grant to form this alliance by the Columbus Zoo back in 2000. So there were several sanctuaries across Africa and all the countries that you can see on the map. In fact, primate sanctuaries, and especially chimpanzee sanctuaries, are some of the oldest conservation projects in the world. Some of them have been around since the 60s, but they were all operating, independently, not really connecting with each other. And some of them got the idea that they really wanted to form an alliance so that they could share expertise and share ideas and become a more powerful voice on behalf of great apes and primates across Africa. So that's exactly what happened. And we've been in existence now for 22 years. We have 23 members in 13 countries, and we provide funding for them. We provide capacity building training. And we also provide accreditation. And that's really important because there are very high standards that an organization has to meet before they can be accredited as a PASA sanctuary. So unfortunately, in August, we had a confiscation of chimpanzees in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The little one on the right did not survive. Chimpanzees are tough. They are tough. They're like people. They can survive horrific things and make it out alive and even be able to thrive after a while. They come into the sanctuaries extremely physically and emotionally traumatized, but the little one on the right did not survive, but the one on the left survived and was moved to a sanctuary in the Congo called the JAC, J-A-C-K. It's a French name, so I won't tell you the French translation, but it's one of the chimpanzee sanctuaries that's part of our alliance. And this little guy was doing great. He was thriving. He was rescued by this man, Eritier Po. He's a Congolese man who is a dedicated conservationist. He takes his motorbike into very remote villages and identifies the primates and great apes that are being kept illegally, and then brings the government in to confiscate them. And he often brings them back on his motorbike to the sanctuaries. He's one of our heroes, but unfortunately he was targeted by local wildlife traffickers this summer. They destroyed his office and all of his work. He lost everything. They burned it to the ground as a warning to him, but it didn't work because he was back on the job the next day, and PASA was able to help him with some funding to get back on his feet. So we work very closely with other partners in Africa to confiscate these animals and get them into a proper sanctuary situation so they can heal and potentially be released back to the wild. We thought we had really hit bottom when that happened with the burning down of his business, but now we're living in another nightmare that's ongoing. Maybe some of you heard about this. This incident has received unbelievable press coverage. Every major newspaper in the country, newspapers in Europe, newspapers in Africa, Smithsonian Magazine, just about CNN, every outlet you can imagine. In September, 3 chimpanzees were kidnapped from one of our PASA sanctuaries, one of our sanctuaries in the Congo. 3 baby chimpanzees were kidnapped, and they are still being held now after more than 2 months. They were kidnapped, and the kidnappers demanded a $200,000 ransom, which of course we could not ever pay because that would just encourage more of this. This is the first time that anybody has ever heard of anything like this happening. As far as we know, the chimpanzees are still alive. They tried to take 5, but 2 of the little babies escaped. So they got 3. As far as we know, they're alive, but this is an ongoing, literally nightmare for our Pasa family. One of our sanctuaries is dealing with this right now. So that's all I'll say about that. But if you Google it, you can read a lot more about this incident. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that drew me to this field of wildlife rescue and rehabilitation are the just unbelievable people, the heroes that do this kind of work. And this is a friend of mine who's named Posa Kamara. She lived in a small village near a sanctuary in Sierra Leone, one of the poorest countries in the world. She came to the sanctuary one day looking for a job. Her husband had died in a fire. And there is very little work for people, especially women, in Sierra Leone. But she became a cook at the sanctuary. And then after a year of being the cook, she went to the director of the sanctuary and she told him that she could take care of the babies, of the orphans. She had grandchildren and children of her own, and she knew how to save those babies. So he gave her a chance. And Mama Posa has become a legend in the Posa family. She has not 1, but 2 books now written about her. And she just has a way with the babies. She works all day long, every day in the nursery at Takugama with however many babies, sometimes 6 or 7 babies that she takes care of. This little one came in with a broken arm, gunshot wounds, starved, completely traumatized. And within a couple of months, she works miracles. So in terms of developing countries, the reason that it matters, why rescue matters, is because of law enforcement. The authorities will not confiscate an animal if they don't have anywhere to take it. So, and that's really the case too for even in Ohio. When our Division of Wildlife, when they confiscate animals, they often end up in rescue centers and at the Ohio Wildlife Center. I'll tell you about one of our animals a little bit later. So these sanctuaries are absolutely key for law enforcement. So shifting over to manatees, I'm sure many of you know that the Columbus Zoo, it's not just a zoo that exhibits manatees, but it's also an official rescue and rehabilitation center for West Indian manatees. I know you've seen pictures like this. There's really hardly a manatee in the wild that doesn't have scars from boat propellers. And this kills a lot of manatees, injures a lot of manatees, and orphans a lot of manatee calves. So in the 90s, when the US Fish and Wildlife Service, which is in charge of all the manatees because they're a protected species, they put a call out to zoos and aquariums across the country asking for help because there are only 3 facilities in Florida that are capable of rescue and rehabilitation and holding of manatees. So they needed more space for all of these manatees that were being rescued. And I'm really proud to say that both Columbus and Cincinnati Zoo stepped up, and we built the most expensive facility we'd ever built up to that point, that opened in 1999, and it's an official manatee rescue and rehabilitation center. And this is a manatee being brought in. The roof on the manatee building is retractable. Maybe you didn't know that, but they come in through the roof, lowered down in these crates into the water. It's quite an operation. And many manatees that have been rehabilitated at the Columbus Zoo have gone back to the wild. And they are tracked. And we are part of the MRP, the Manatee Rehabilitation Partnership, that conducts post-release monitoring to make sure these manatees are doing okay. And if they're not, they can be located and brought back into captivity. So just to close my talk, I would like to spend a little bit of time speaking about the Ohio Wildlife Center. As I mentioned, I look at us as a part of a global network of people doing this type of work. And we have been in existence since 1984. I still run into a lot of people that have never heard of the Ohio Wildlife Center, and that's troubling to me. So it's a part of a big part of the job that I have at the Columbus Zoo, at the Ohio Wildlife Center as the conservation liaison, is doing presentations out in the community to raise awareness about about what the Ohio Wildlife Center does and how people can become involved. So in 2021, we had more than 8,000 animals enter our hospital. We're on track to have the same, probably about 8,400 animals by the end of 2022. Of course, many of them don't survive their injuries, especially the ones that have been hit by cars, but about 40% do survive. Many of the animals we receive are orphans, and we have a wonderful group of home care volunteers because we could not possibly take care of the literally hundreds and hundreds of possums, squirrels, rabbits, and other babies that we get in the spring. We have home care volunteers that are well-trained, and they are licensed by the state of Ohio, by the Division of Wildlife, to do this work and partner with us. 90% of the animals that we receive at our hospital are brought to us by individual citizens. We do have a volunteer rescue team that can go out and pick up animals, but as you can imagine, that is very difficult to keep up with, especially in the spring. So we really rely on our compassionate, empathetic citizens who bring individual animals to us. And it's a wonderful time for us to make a connection with them and thank them for their taking the time to save an animal. So what we do at the Ohio Wildlife Center is we rescue animals that are injured. Believe it or not, this is a red-tailed hawk. It's pretty much not recognizable, but if you come out to our center on our open house Sundays, you will see this red-tailed hawk whose name is Torch. He landed on an electrical transformer. He was very badly burned. And he was burned so badly that his beak actually fell off. And our vet created an artificial beak out of dental bonding that she attached, and beaks grow back. And so, so he could properly eat while he was healing. And it took a long time for him to heal, but he looks beautiful now, and you can see him if you come out. He can't be released because he's blind in one eye, and that's no good for a raptor. We rescue animals that are sick. This is an example of a couple of fox that are suffering from mange, which is very treatable. And animals that have lost their parents. About 4,000 of the 8,000 animals we receive are orphaned. These are little chipmunks, if you can't tell. Chipmunk is one of our 7 species of squirrels in Ohio, and one of only 2 species in Ohio that are true hibernators. The other one is the groundhog, the largest squirrel in Ohio. And we rescue, rehabilitate animals that are stolen from the wild. And that's a perfectly descriptive word, because it's illegal to take native Ohio wildlife out of the wild to keep it as a pet. And as I said earlier, nothing in nature wants to be a pet. This is a little box turtle. And then we really rehabilitate. And sometimes this just takes maybe a few days, a few weeks, and sometimes several months. This was a visitor from way up north, a snowy owl, which don't live in Ohio, but they do come into Ohio on a pretty regular basis. And this one was unfortunately hit by a car a couple of years ago. And some wonderful person pulled over and picked up this owl and brought it to our hospital. It had a wing, it was emaciated. It was probably hit by a car, we don't know, but we think so. It took many, many months of rehabilitation to bring this snowy owl back to good health. Learn how to fly in our big flight enclosure that we have out at we have 2 locations. We have our hospital, which is off of Sawmill Road, the intake hospital, and then we have a pre-release facility and our education center that's up in Powell. And then the greatest day, our happiest moment, when we were able to release this animal. And this releases, when we can invite people to those, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to connect with the public and to connect with all the people that care so much about wildlife in Ohio, and really spread the word about how much we need wildlife in our lives, and how much we need wildlife to maintain healthy ecosystems, as you all know through the work that you do. This is an immature bald eagle that was released last summer. And we educate. I'm actually part of the education department. We have 3 full-time people in our education department and other part-time people, and we do hundreds of programs throughout Central Ohio every year, educating the public about wildlife. And we also have at our center 60 non-releasable wild animals. They have various injuries that they are healthy, and they can live out their lives in captivity, but they can't be released for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's eye injuries or behavioral issues. We had a coyote that was confiscated as a young animal from a dog fighting ring in Ohio. And it was brought to us by the Division of Wildlife. And her name was Hope. And she lived for almost 18 years. And it was a wonderful opportunity for us to speak to people about coyotes and dispel the many crazy myths and disinformation, misinformation that people have about coyotes. And we're so fortunate to have one of the world's leading authorities, experts on coyotes, Dr. Stan Garrett, here at Ohio State. And if you've never heard a presentation by Stan Garrett, get out there wherever he's speaking. It's fascinating. There are populations of coyotes in every single large city in our country, including downtown Columbus, downtown Chicago, Los Angeles. Every major city has a population of coyotes. They're incredibly smart. They are monogamous. They mate for life. They're devoted parents to their pups. They're a lot like people, actually. So coyotes are sort of one of my passions, and I try my best to help people understand coyotes and what they're really like instead of what they may have heard. One of our biggest challenges going forward is to keep as many animals in the wild as possible. Because an animal's best chance for survival is with its natural parents. We often have animals come into our hospital that like, for example, baby bunnies, that people find a nest of baby bunnies and they don't see the mother around, so they assume they're orphaned. But single mothers like rabbits and most wild mothers that are single mothers, they have to feed themselves. So they are they're obligated to leave their babies for sometimes hours every day, and white-tailed deer, obviously the same. And so we really focus on educating people about knowing when an animal really needs help and when it doesn't. And that's really important, because that's the best chance for survival for an animal to remain with its natural mother and father. So I think why rescue rehabilitation and why it matters in Ohio might be a little bit different from why it matters in Africa, although really there are similarities all over the world. But for us, I believe it's really about coexistence. And I'll tell you why. The recent explosion of wildlife in American cities and suburbs is one of the greatest ecological success stories since the dawn of conservation. That is a very bold statement, and one that just kind of gives me goosebumps. We drove the wild animals out of our cities and suburbs, and they have come back in a big way. And this is a quote from Peter Allegan, who's he's an environmental historian, a conservation scientist, and a professor at the University of California. He's written a fantastic new book called The Accidental Ecosystem. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it or read it already. Just give you some of the highlights from his book. He says that cities rank among the fastest growing ecosystems on Earth. Many cities and suburbs in America have more wild animals living in them than at any time in the past 150 years. Animals find what they need: food, water, shelter, space, and relative safety living among us, believe it or not. Wildlife-rich cities are an unintended result of decisions people made decades ago. So these decisions that were made by cities and suburbs, they weren't really made for wildlife, although that's happening more and more. Like what Carolyn does with pollinator gardens, we're starting to be much more purposeful about creating habitat for wildlife in our cities and suburbs, but it kind of happened by accident. And sure some of us, I know I am old enough to remember when cities like Cleveland and Pittsburgh looked like this. And when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire in the 70s, which actually it caught on fire many times, but when it caught on fire one time, it really got the attention of the public. And it's one of the things that launched the first Earth Day in 1970. And this is the Cuyahoga River today. And over these past decades, people have decided to clean up this river for people, for human health. But of course, what's happened because of that, now the river harbors 44 species of fish. And then one of the great stories, one of my favorite stories that came out during the pandemic that made me do a happy dance was another animal that has come back to the Cuyahoga River, which is the river otter. River otters were reintroduced into Ohio, and now they're showing up in places like the Cuyahoga River. So it's a long way from a river on fire to otters swimming and catching fish in the Cuyahoga River. I love the Grange Insurance Audubon Center as another example of an area that was a complete, polluted, industrial site that has been reclaimed in such a beautiful way. And thanks to the citizens of Columbus, especially the bird watchers that knew the importance of this area as a major flyway for migratory birds. And instead of it being completely developed with apartments and hotels and other things, it's now an incredible resource in our downtown, and wetlands being restored back to their natural state. So another Ohio State professor, Jeremy Bruscotter, who is a sociologist, says that public support for conservation efforts, as well as efforts to increase the well-being of animals, is very high, perhaps as high as it has ever been. So this really gives me hope. And I see this every day in my conversations with people. People are starting to get it. We have disrespected nature and we have disrespected animals. And now it's time to make amends for them and for us. So we can, together, we can rescue and heal wildlife and give them a second chance at life. And the bald eagle is such a great example to me of a success story. When I first came down to Columbus in the early 70s to go to Ohio State University, there were 3 pairs of bald eagles left in Ohio. Of course, that was because of DDT and the thinning of their eggshells and the loss of all those birds. Now there are at least 800 pairs of bald eagles in Ohio. So we can do it. We can bring wildlife back. Wildlife, a lot of wild animals are very resilient if we just give them half a chance. We can create landscapes of peaceful coexistence. It's all about education and about us wanting to live peacefully with these animals. I like to end with one of my favorite quotes from the late, great Rachel Carson, who really, I think, puts into beautiful words what it does for us to live around wild animals and know wild animals and love wild animals. Those who dwell among the beauties and mysteries of the earth are never alone or weary of life. Thank you so much for your attention tonight. And I told you that I found a great quote I think you guys are going to like. Lawn is nature under totalitarian rule. So that's one for you to use when you're doing your your turf replacement. So I'd be happy to take questions. I don't know what time it is. I hope I didn't go too long.
No, you're great. Yeah,
if you have time for questions, I'd be happy to take them if we do have the time. If everybody wants to unmute.
Folks, if you have questions, you can either unmute or type it in the chat and I'll read it for you. I had a question. So while we're waiting for questions from the rest of the audience, if people see an injured animal like a raptor, should they try to catch it and bring it to the Ohio Wildlife Center, or does Ohio Wildlife Center have staff that comes out and catch the animal? I mean, what should we do if we see something like that?
Well, that's a really great question. So if you see, so just like you, as an example, a raptor that you see is injured, visibly injured, can't fly. If it's a young bird that's out of the nest on the ground in the spring, that's a different story. That needs a little bit more investigation because it's very common for young birds to end up on the ground, before they're able to fully fly, at least for for a few days. And so we don't want to take them out of the wild. Best thing to do with them is, if you can, pick them up and put them on a branch. But I made the mistake one time of picking up a barred owl down in the Park of Roses, a little baby owl, and it was fully feathered. So it had left the nest. And if they're not feathered, then they definitely need rescued because they're too far away from flying. They have to be rescued, but they can be put back in the nest. So there's an old wives' tale about, if you touch a bird, the parents will reject it. That's completely not true. They will totally not reject it. They're wonderful parents. But to answer your question, if you feel that you can safely pick up that bird, and you have a way to you have something to wrap around it. A lot of our volunteers and our people that are familiar with what we do, they carry stuff in their cars. So they're ready. They have carriers in their cars, they have blankets. And so, but if you don't feel comfortable, we have a wonderful Facebook page. It's called our Rescue and Response Team. And if you go to that Facebook page, Ohio Wildlife Center Rescue and Response Team, and you enter your information and the location and your phone number, our rescue team, they're out there every day, all day, and they will respond to those calls. So that's how we get a lot of the animals. We don't really have staff that are able to do that, but that rescue team does a fantastic job.
Anna, did you want to ask a question? Or everybody else says? I saw you just turn your camera on. So
Oh, I just turned it on. No, hi, Rebecca.
Yeah, you know each other, right?
No, I just turned it on in case there was any conversation. Yeah, I've been with the center since 2011 myself.
Annalise has asked the question, can you volunteer to be on the rescue and response team?
Hi, Diana. Diana, would you share anything about your experience as a volunteer at the Ohio Wildlife Center?
Sure. So by trade, I'm a veterinarian, and I ran into Dr. Burton one day back many years ago, back before he passed away. And he was just so enthusiastic and so wonderful. And I started volunteering in the hospital at that point. I've kind of been in all parts of the organization at some point or another. I've helped out in education, but primarily I do hospital and home care. So I specialize in home care of neonates, especially because of my medical background. So I'm the one who gets the little 0-day-old babies, squirrels and bats and woodchucks and possums and things. And it's really it's been a wonderful experience. Given how much of the reason that these animals are at the hospital is human influence, it's been wonderful to be able to try to counterbalance some of that human influence. And yeah, I've done thousands of hours, and I don't regret it one bit, and I don't regret the sleep that I give up for the babies. But there are definitely roles for just about anybody's level of involvement, even if it's just answering questions for people on the Facebook group or on the hotline, or if you want to go out and do rescue. Our rescue team, Dave, kind of will train and get everybody up to speed who wants to be involved in that. He can teach you how to go out and go on goose chases, literally, and work with raptors and all sorts of wonderful things. So it's a really rewarding experience to be able to help counterbalance the human impact.
I have to, I think I said it before, but I have to say it again, that the Ohio Wildlife Center could not exist without people like Diana. The volunteers are just absolutely critical. Dr. Burton was a friend of mine too, Diana, and he was a hero of mine, really. I've known him for years because before Dr. Burton started the Ohio Wildlife Center, people used to bring the orphans, the possums and the bunnies to the Columbus Zoo. So now we have proper facilities and properly trained people to take care of these animals. So we just had our Ohio Wildlife Rehabilitators Association conference a couple weeks ago. And were you there, Diana?
Yep. I actually spoke at it
Oh,
on
you did a great
neonates
job.
this year.
Oh, great. Yeah, so that's an organization that's wonderful, that provides networking and training and an annual conference. I don't do animal care directly. I did some of that years ago, but my mission now is to get out into the community and tell people about the Ohio Wildlife Center and what we do and about really wildlife rescue all over the world. Thank you, Diane.
Do a great job. Your education, your program was so good. Looks like Petra has a question. Petra, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, the question is regarding combating misinformation. Of course, many people have this issue with coyote, which is not true. But a little while ago at one of Columbus Park and Rec areas, what we call the sheep farm or the West Case Road new park, which is a 60-acre former sheep farm from OSU, people started posting on Facebook that first they saw it was a cougar, and then it was downgraded to a bobcat. And of course, in that habitat, I think that it's very doubtful. So what do? I mean, my first gut reaction was to post back, we saw Sasquatch, but obviously that's totally the wrong direction to go. My first question is, I assume in a habitat surrounded by development, it's a 68 or 55-acre property, it's highly unlikely that there would be a bobcat, let alone a cougar. But how do you correct people that come up with stuff like this?
Petra, I'm sorry. I dropped out. I didn't hear your question. I keep getting this message that says my internet connection is unstable, and I dropped out and I just came back on. So sorry, could you ask me again?
So the question is, I'm familiar with the misconceptions that people have about coyote. You know, they eat my little dog and so forth. But recently there was an incident that people posted on a Facebook page for the Friends of the Sheep Farm. The sheep farm is Columbus Recreation and Park facility of about 60 acres grassland that was a former sheep farm surrounded by development just south of the OSU airport, that they claimed that they saw a cougar. And then it was downgraded to, oh, maybe it was a bobcat. But it's highly unlikely that there's any of those in that environment, I would guess. So the question is, how do you deal with that kind of misconception and correct it? I think she's dropped out again.
I can maybe help a little bit. If it was that close to
Bob-
OSU, it was unlikely to be a bobcat, though their
Right.
numbers are increasing around the state. Now, we did recently, I can tell you, we have a big Discord group for the Wildlife Center, and we get photos and videos sent to us by people to identify a species or something. And we just had one a couple weeks ago where they sent us a photo, and it was a big old tomcat. You know, it was not a bobcat. It was just a larger sized domestic cat. So we have a big group. If people can get us video or photos that we can identify for the people. But yeah, combating misinformation is always tough. And Rebecca probably deals with it more than I do, though I do my share of talking to people too, but it's tough.
Yeah, I mean, we should be so lucky to see a bobcat. And I mean, yes, we have bobcats in Ohio. I know that some people say that they're increasing in numbers, but I actually, I don't know if that's actually true, because when I ask people from the Division of Wildlife, how many bobcats are there in Ohio, they don't have any idea. So I don't know that they're increasing. I hope that's the case, but I don't know if that's true or not. But bobcats eat mice and small things, and actually so do coyotes. Now, coyotes, of course, they can be a danger to cats that are left outside, you know, and small dogs. And, you know, I mean, it's a matter of you know, controlling your pet, taking care of your pet. There have been times, you know, there are conflicts with coyotes, but for the most part, the number one reason that people have conflict with coyotes is because of feeding them. Maybe not intentionally feeding coyotes, although some people do that, but unintentionally feeding them by having dog or cat food outside and attracting them in and getting them used to people. So that's the number one thing. But of course, the best place to go for coyote information, it's called the Urban Coyote Research Project, Urban Coyote Research Project. That's Dr. Stan Garrett's website. And there is just a wealth of wonderful information about coyotes. Coyotes are not normally nocturnal, but when they live in cities and suburbs, they become nocturnal. So that's why we really don't see them very often, because they're not moving around during the day for the most part.
Any other questions?
I had one. In terms of things like adding like bird feeders, for example, what are your thoughts on things like that?
Bird feeders? Well, that's a really great question. I mean, everybody loves to feed the birds because we love to have the birds come close. Personally, I don't feed birds at my house. I live in Clintonville. I have a hummingbird feeder. Part of the reason I don't have bird feeders is because there's a lot of hawks in the neighborhood, and you know, and nothing against hawks, but I think I don't feel right about drawing birds into my feeders so they can be, you know, bait for the hawks. So they find their food just fine without that. So for that reason, what we find is that you know, bird feeders are okay as long as people take care of them. They have to be kept clean, because birds congregate at bird feeders. If they're not kept clean, they are places, as Diana can tell you, for disease transmission. So we try to put a lot of information out there on our social media about responsible bird feeding, I guess is the way to put it. So yeah, I mean, I think it's great. People love it. You know, I would never tell people not to feed the birds, but I would tell them to make sure that you're taking care of your bird feeders, and have them try to have them in places that you know, the birds have some cover while they're feeding.
And
Then,
as you pointed out. Go ahead, Anna.
yeah, I had a second question. In terms of, I know that we've in many ways basically decimated wildlife and you know, the natural food sources that they would have and the cover that they would have, et cetera, et cetera. So I know that there's a lot of human damage that we have done to the natural life. So natural life cycles are definitely interrupted, no doubt. But that being said, how do we balance something like a wild animal getting mange? How do you balance the intervention versus letting the circle of life happen without even more human intervention? I know it's a tough balance because we've already created very difficult, we've made it very difficult for the natural world to exist naturally. But are we helping, are we hurting? How do you know when to intervene and when to let the circle of life do its thing?
Well, that's a really good question. That's really a philosophical question. But I think that at this point, we have so altered the natural world, as you said, that there is just such a tremendous amount of intervention in terms of wildlife that, that we're not going to be turning that clock back anytime soon. I understand what you're saying, that it's so if an animal has a disease, maybe it's better to just, let it die naturally. And of course, that's what normally happens. That's the normal course that happens. But in a few cases, people find animals that are sick, and they bring them to the center. And mange is one thing that we can treat successfully, and the animal can be released back to the wild. So I'm fine with that. I'm okay with that. I think that's a fine role for us to play.
Is there anything we can do to reduce mite populations or the things that cause mange in our yard that wouldn't disrupt nature? I know that you use environmectin to treat it, but is there anything that we can do to, like, is it coming from poorly managed compost piles, or is it something that we're doing, or is that just a natural, some animals will get mange and we can treat them when we find them?
I think Diana will be good to answer that one. I can't really answer that. I'm not really sure about that.
There's a couple different things. First of all, the mange mite that lives on them is a canine predator. Canine insect that lives on canines only. So people that have dogs that have mange could potentially be giving it to foxes if they end up in the same space. So people keeping their dogs healthy in various diseases, not just mange, but distemper and things like that, can help keep the foxes safe.
And not
but
letting them run loose.
Right. But the other thing is, it is thought that there are various factors that cause foxes to be weakened, which then allows the mange to take over. So things like foxes being exposed to rodenticides through their food sources is thought to be one thing that causes them to be more susceptible to mange. So it's all interconnected. So making sure that things like rodenticides and such aren't out there to end up weakening them. So there are indirect things that can be done, but if you're talking about, like, otherwise you'd be putting down pesticides and things like that, and then you've got all of the unintended consequences of those. But really keeping domestic dogs healthy and preventing things like rodenticides and stuff that could weaken the foxes would be the biggest.
And the way I understand it, Diana, is that this is something they can recover from on their own naturally.
They can, but foxes are not as good at it as domestic dogs. Domestic dogs are much better at it. Foxes tend to have a very severe inflammatory response to it. So if they're weakened by anything else, then it's really hard. It can be really hard for them to clear it.
And certainly going into the winter, if they've lost their fur, they're not going to survive if they have mange going into a winter.
And that's usually when, a lot of them that are mangy in the summer will tell people to watch them and see if they bounce back from it, or see if they're getting worse and getting in peril for the winter. And then that's usually when we'll step up efforts to try to trap and treat.
I wanted to just throw out one more thing quickly. I spoke to our Franklin County Wildlife Officer recently, Brad Kiger, and I was asking him about wildlife trafficking in Ohio. And we do in fact have illegal wildlife trade and trafficking in Ohio. It's not common, but there was a really huge case a couple of years ago where people ended up going to jail. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was involved in it. What he told me was that, what used to take place, it's mostly reptiles and amphibians trade for the pet trade. What used to happen, in the back of a van with a couple of animals, now it all takes place on the internet. So all of this illegal, and that's the case for primates in Africa as well. It's all done over the internet. And so what Brad told me is that they now have 2 people within the Division of Wildlife that are dedicated to cyber crime against animals. So so that is something, it's not only in Africa or in Southeast Asia, it does happen here as well.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you so much, Rebecca and Diana, too. Great information from you both. What a fantastic presentation. I learned so much, not
Thank you so
about
much.
the community, but around the world, what's going on with wildlife and our impact. I mean, the statistic that's going to hang with me is that 96% of mammals are livestock and humans. And we're just,
Yeah.
our impact on the planet is just amazing. So anything we can do to help wildlife. Diana put in the chat the website if we want to get involved as a volunteer. And I assume that you rely heavily on donations as well, Rebecca.
We rely completely on donations. We don't receive any funding from the state, or so individual donations and grants, and that's the way that we are able to do what we do every year.
That's awesome. So yeah, the year's coming up, you're thinking about some year-end donations, please consider the Ohio Wildlife Center. That's a great potential source or place to donate your money.
I'm going to be starting a lecture series at the Wildlife Center starting in February. We're going to be starting a conservation lecture series. So if it's okay, I'll forward that information to you so you can share it with the group. Our first speaker is going to be Jim McCormick. He's going to speak on bird migration. And then the next ones are to be announced, but this is something I've been working on for a while. And so we want to bring people together out at the Wildlife Center in our barn and share information and learn to appreciate our wildlife even more.
Definitely, that's something I would be interested in personally, and yeah, Flo can help spread the word on that too.
Thank you.
All right, with that, thanks again. Really appreciate your time, Rebecca, and everybody for attending. Great program this evening. Everybody keep safe and watch out for the snow this evening. Oh, Annalise has another question.
Oh.
Sorry, I just realized, if you had an animal, I had neighbors that had a raccoon family that had crawled down their fireplace, and they called what they thought was just a wildlife rescue that would trap them and release them away from houses. And what they found out was that they ended up legally having to kill all of the raccoons because they had, I guess, been introduced to humans, and therefore they might learn that humans were a good source of food. And so because they contacted this one wildlife capturing service, they were now legally obligated to let them kill these animals. So my question is, how do you know the difference between calling someone? I mean, obviously, if we call the Ohio Wildlife Center, we know that it's safe, but how do you know the difference between calling someone that's actually going to trap and release the animal versus trap and kill the animal?
Well, that's a great question, Annalise. And I've known so many people that have gotten sucked into that misinformation about what these services do. But the good news is that there are 2 services in our area that are that do humane, non-lethal wildlife exclusion. One is within the Ohio Wildlife Center. It's called SCRAM. And I didn't have a chance to really talk about that, but that's kind of a whole other talk of what SCRAM does. But that was the brainchild of Dr. Burton, our founder. Many years ago, he was getting so many calls from people about bats in their attic, raccoons in their attic, skunks in their window wells, and all these kinds of things. And he started SCRAM as a fee for service, resource for our citizens. So SCRAM is one of them. And then we had a guy who actually was part of starting SCRAM at the Ohio Wildlife Center, who went off on his own, and his organization is called TLC, and he also does only humane, non-lethal trapping of wildlife. They also fix whatever, it doesn't do any good to remove something from your attic if you don't fix the way it got in there in the first place. So they complete the circle. They do the whole thing. They do the inspection of the property. They figure out what's in there. They humanely get the animals out, and then they fix the problem. So Scram, TLC, those are the two. If there are other ones that are humane, non-lethal, I don't know about them. So if anybody else knows of any other services like that, but for the most part, the animals are killed.
I don't know
Thank
of
you so much.
any others either, but if any place says that they are going to relocate them,
Yeah,
that
that's
is not legal. The state does not allow relocation of them. It wasn't that they couldn't release them. Well, if they were in Central Ohio, if this person was in Central Ohio, you are legally allowed to take them out there to, get them out of the house as long as they are released on that same property.
on that.
They are not legally allowed to be relocated. They would have to be euthanized if the person will not allow them to be on that same property.
Right, and that's a rule that's passed down to us through the Division of Wildlife. Those are our rules that we have to follow because raccoons are rabies vector species. So yeah, but they can be, if people will allow them to be released on their property, which a lot of people, they don't want the animals killed. Then that's the solution for that. And raccoons have more than one. So if you worry that you're taking them out of their home that's in your attic and you're going to put them out and they're not going to have anywhere to go, they have at least one other, sometimes 2 or 3 other dens around the neighborhood. So we've seen it many times. They move their babies to another place.
Thank you. I will share that with my neighbors.
You're welcome. Yeah. Yeah, it's possible to do all that in a non-lethal way. You just have to know the organizations that do it.
Thanks again.
Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Annalise. Thank you for the question. Thank you, everybody. Have a great evening and happy Thanksgiving. Thanks again, Rebecca.
Thank you. Goodbye.